Okay, let me get this straight. So there's this huge chemical explosion there, pretty close by Houston area. And all of a sudden, there's a stay-at-home orders issue? Really? Well, let's find out.
Some type of chemical plant is blown up. They're requesting our assistance.
Plumes of black smoke billowing from a chemical plant this morning after an explosion shaking the small town about an hour north of Houston, injuring one employee.
Pretty scary not knowing what's burning out there.
The explosion sending a fiery plume so high, the black smoky haze could briefly be seen on satellite. Authorities issued an immediate 5-mile shelter in place, evacuating an area school as crews shut down a state highway.
A familiar sight around these parts, a plume of dark smoke settled over the Houston area yesterday after yet another toxic chemical explosion. Now lawmakers are demanding better regulations and environmental protections. I almost don't even know where to start with this story because my brain is just flooded with thoughts and feelings and frustrations. But a good place to start is always with the facts, so here they are. The chemical explosion actually took place about an hour north of Houston in San Jacinto County. It was at the Sound Resource Solutions plant, which makes solvents for paint remover and glue. Anyone who has ever dealt with glue and paint solvent knows that those are some pretty harsh and volatile chemicals that need to be treated very carefully. The explosion was apparently triggered by a forklift, creating a giant plume of smoke that looked like, I don't know, like an F4 tornado. Quite a sight for Texans driving along Highway 59. So some of you might know that I live in Houston, but I'm on the south side, so this time I was pretty far away from the explosion. But the sad reality is that these things aren't uncommon for those of us in the Houston area. When the news of this broke, I don't even think I reacted much. I wasn't planning on leaving the house yesterday, so there was literally nothing else I could do besides continue to not leave my house. A few people from out of town, including my TYT producer, checked in on me to see if the explosion was anywhere near me, which was very, very sweet of them. But those check-ins kind of reminded me that, oh, this isn't normal, or it's not supposed to be. As a Houstonian, these chemical explosions have become somewhat normal. We're used to carcinogens being kicked in the air only for our local officials to tell us everything's fine, because honestly, what else are they going to say? It's already out there. We're already breathing it all in. There's only so much anyone can do about a thing once it has already happened. So then you have to ask, what can be done to prevent it from happening in the first place? Why does it keep happening? On the Houston subreddit, someone posted a Google review for Sound Resource Solutions from a few months ago. The review said, quote, "This company does not mix correctly. They take shortcuts. The owner knows and does nothing. The so-called supervisor is a bully and will make the workers take the shortcuts even though he knows what it could do. The owner knows that as well and continues to not do anything. So many safety hazards at this job that was also brought to the owner's attention and still nothing has been done. They will be reported." In 2019, Houston made international headlines for another plume of smoke that came out of a petrochemical plant in Deer Park, Texas, which is on the east side of Houston. The fire burned for 3 days. I remember being downtown on a balcony outside that day and seeing a strange cloud across the sky, only to find out that it was a big cloud of chemicals. Fast forward over 4 years later, the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board published a 100-page report stating that the plant could have taken several steps to prevent the fire not only from happening in the first place, but also from escalating. The report said that the fire, quote, significantly impacted the environment. And by the way, this was after local officials told us everything was fine. There was benzene in the air and in our water, but everything was fine. Local birds and fish were dying, but everything was fine. At the time of the explosion, locals were told to shelter in place, but the Texas Tribune reported in April of this year, so again, 4 years after the explosion, that despite being told that things were fine, after children were allowed to return to school, benzene emissions remained at dangerously high levels for more than 2 weeks after the shelter ordinance had been lifted. The Texas Tribune also reported that the EPA and the state of Texas were aware of the risks of this particular petrochemical plant, and they did little to nothing about it. Another fire this past May, also in Deer Park at the Shell facility, resulted in another plume of carcinogens in the air, and it sent 5 workers to the hospital for quote-unquote precautionary reasons. A few months later, the state of Texas filed a lawsuit against Shell seeking $1 million in damages on the grounds of environmental damage to the air and waterways. So a lot coming out of Deer Park, Texas. Deer Park isn't too far from where I live. I have friends who live there. It's very much an oil and gas town. The place looks humble enough, but the people who live there actually earn competitive salaries because a lot of them work at the plants. Oil and gas pays very well around these parts, but the risk is built into the salary. People who live on the east side of Houston along the ship channel, which is where most of the plants and refineries are, actually have a much lower life expectancy than people who live on the west side of the city, not even an hour's drive away. Something that tends to come up whenever these stories break is something called regulatory capture, which basically means that regulatory agencies that are put in place to protect the public interest become compromised and infiltrated by the very people they're supposed to be regulating against. In other words, it's bureaucratic corruption. Then there are constant debates between whether or not big government is better than smaller government in terms of protecting the public interest, i.e., the environment and public health, versus protecting economic interests, some of which include public interests like jobs and wages. Something you'll hear a lot from right-wing conservatives is that regulation is bad for the economy, that it hinders corporate growth while doing little to actually protect people from the harmful effects of said growth. The more liberal left wing will say that regulation is needed to prevent these corporations from running amok with little concern or regard for the environment. Something that I think both sides should, at least in theory, be able to agree upon is that regulatory agencies themselves aren't perfect. Government agencies are not perfect. They're run by people, so they are susceptible to corrupting influences. However, the response to just do nothing instead is simply not tenable. And for those of us living along the Gulf Coast and in other similar areas, it is an ongoing fight between humane environmental practices and corporate interests. All right, there's a lot more that can be said on this topic, but I will leave it there. If you got anything out of this, please like.
Crazy, yeah. What that tells you. Oh, go suicide, man. Oh, my goodness. Anyway, no matter my job. Peace out.